Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, friends. This is Edward Ahmed Mitchell, the National Deputy Director of the Council on American Islamic Relations. On behalf of the whole CAIR team, hope all of you are doing well and staying safe. May Allah grant all of you a successful Ramadan. Very happy to have you with us today for our episode of CAIR on Air. We're going to be focusing on the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. Many of you know that was yesterday, March 15th. And many organizations and governments around the world have been doing initiatives and taking actions to mark this important day. To discuss the history of this day, what it's meant to commemorate, and what the Muslim community and our friends in other communities can do to combat the scourge of global Islamophobia, I want to bring on our special guests for a great conversation. First, we have Corey Saylor, who is the Research and Advocacy Director here at CAIR National. Assalamu alaikum, Corey. How are you?
Alaikum salam. Doing all right, Edward. Good to see you.
Hamza, thank you. And we also have Ammar Ansari, who is the Research and Advocacy Coordinator and a new addition to the CAIR family, coming to us from Berkeley out in California. Assalamu alaikum, Ammar. How are you?
Assalamu alaikum, Edward. Doing well. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Alhamdulillah. Good. And Ammar, check your audio. It might be a little fuzzy, but I think we're going to be okay, inshallah. So, Corey, let me start with you. Tell us about the significance of March 15th, the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. How did this come about? What does the day signify? Just give us some of the background.
I think it came about because of a day that we all remember very vividly, and that was the attacks at Christchurch, New Zealand, when really a madman, but a white supremacist, went out and murdered Muslim worshippers at two different mosques and live streamed the whole thing. And, that tragedy was something that touched the world. I remember waking up at 3:00 in the morning and my phone was, there were texts all over the place, and never really even got a chance to absorb the tragedy because we had to start working so quickly. But the impact of more than 50 people being killed, like in that short a period of time, I don't think any of us can really give words to. So that's how it got started. What happened is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation decided to start a day, the International Day to Combat Islamophobia, and they timed it to the anniversary of the Christchurch attacks. And then they went to the United Nations and they pushed the United Nations to do the same. And the United Nations adopted a resolution last year, which is why we have the first UN observed International Day to Combat Islamophobia this year. So that's like the mechanics of it. But I think if we talk about what it means for us, I think it's really easy for us to dwell on just the enormous tragedy of Islamophobia, right? I already talked about Christchurch. It's not just Muslims who are impacted by it. Everyone will remember the first person murdered in a backlash attack after 9/11 was Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh who looked to his attacker like a Muslim. That's the tragic side of it. But on the other hand, we have this international body deciding it's time that we start talking about this. And they're giving us as a community time to have our voice heard and talk about the really positive things that are going on in terms of the pushback against Islamophobia. So we can get into that a bit later, but I do want people to remember it starts with a tragedy, but what we can really think about right now is the opportunities and the inspiration that we can take so that those lives, not only those that were lost in Christchurch, but in all these other horrific things that have happened with Islamophobia, like we're giving them some sort of meaning, right? You can never take away the tragedy, but we're giving it some sort of meaning by making sure it doesn't happen to others in the future, using this day to talk about it.
Absolutely. God willing, inshallah. So, Mara, let me go to you. On that note, what are some of the things that you've been focusing on with other members of the community to raise awareness about during this week? Some of the great videos you put out there. What are some of the major topics that you try to highlight for people during this week as we mark International Day to Combat Islamophobia?
Absolutely. What we need to recognize when it came to March 15th, because this is the date that centers around the United Nations designation, is something that Muslims knew for the longest time, and that is Islamophobia is international. And this is especially something we should talk about when we talk about the role of technology, and social media when it comes to Islamophobia. Now, I always see social media as both something that could be used for good or bad. And Christchurch was a clear example of social media being used for bad. This was an Australian citizen who committed a massacre in New Zealand and broadcast it to the world on Facebook Live for its audiences of white supremacists to see in the United States, the United Kingdom, all over the world. So this was clearly an act of international Islamophobia. And that is important to recognize because we need to talk about why global Islamophobia now more than ever is something that we need to combat. With that said, I also want to talk about how social media can be used as a tool for good because it is a tool just like anything else, depends how we wield it. And I see a lot of remarkable examples in recent activism. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as Muhammad and Muna al-Kurd in the West Bank, in which they bring really important global awareness to issues that are very important to them. And that is something that we should do when it comes to Islamophobia. We should talk about us as Muslims. What does Islamophobia mean to us? It's something that our communities may have internalized. It's something that we face as it is an institutional discrimination that we at CAIR always try to address on a day-to-day basis. So the important work that we want to do when it comes to our social media campaigns is to recognize that we have the agency to combat Islamophobia when it's used against us through this technology. And we can do this together.
Absolutely, Charles. So Corey, talk to me about the other major initiative that we were able to do this week in coordination with other organizations around the world. Share detail about that with the audience.
Edward, it's the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. So when we were thinking about how we wanted to approach it, it didn't feel right to just do a domestic context because we know, as Ammar mentioned, Islamophobia is a global phenomenon, and the network that pushes Islamophobia feeds off of each other. So for instance, Europe, Geert Wilders used to come, Dutch politician, used to come to the United States all the time to preach his particular brand of anti-Muslim hate. And we know that many of the people who have taken aggressive action, who have murdered people, have been inspired by writings of American Islamophobes as they did their acts in other countries. So we looked global for this one. And what we did is we put together a statement of unity with 13 other Muslim organizations from around the planet. So the Federation of European Muslim Youth Organization in Europe, which represents 31 different countries, Muslim Council of Britain, which represents over 500 mosques, a number of other organizations that are an umbrella over many different organizations. And what these 13 different institutions agreed to do is to work together to combat the Islamophobia that's being pushed at us on this global stage.
Absolutely. So some of the organizations that I think joined us, Corey, were representing, I think, 30 different countries or operating in 30 different countries. So the Muslim Council of Britain, the Australian Council of Islamic Imams, the Committee for Justice and Liberty in France, the Association Muslims for Human Rights in Spain, the Collective Against Islamophobia in Europe, which, by the way, is the successor group to the CCIF, which is the major Muslim civil rights group that was shut down in France due to anti-Muslim bigotry. So this is really, I agree, a historic moment of unity for the Muslim community. So often we see Muslims who are suffering Islamophobia being ignored, right? Uyghur Muslims in China, locked in concentration camps. They don't have many governments in the Muslim world speaking up for them. And in the midst of that silence, it falls to Muslim organizations to speak up. So I'm so grateful that we were able to bring together Muslim organizations from around the Western world to say that we stand in solidarity with each other and Muslims who are being victimized by injustice, and all people who are being victimized by injustice around the world. I think it was a really important moment of unity on this very significant day. Ammar, let me come back to you. One of the things that people might wonder on this day is, what can I do to, number one, help, and what do I do if I experience Islamophobia? I think you and I believe Asiya had a great video with some guidance about what to do if someone experiences Islamophobia in person, witnesses it being directed at someone else, or experiences, any sort of harassment based on that kind of bigotry. What sort of advice would you want to see and want to share with the audience, something practical they can take with them in case they see this in their daily life?
Absolutely. And I think that's an important question, Edward, because Islamophobic content is very hard to witness when we see it online, especially when it comes to our youth. When we see these disgusting tweets and images that are very much attacking who we are as an identity. And I've seen firsthand a lot of young Muslims internalize it, and really it affects their self-esteem and self-worth. So it's an important question. And one of the first things I would advise is make sure that you're doing okay, right? It's a big attack on your mental health, for example, and your self-esteem. So make sure that you're talking to people that you trust and talk about the content that you have just experienced or witnessed. Because what matters first is your safety, whether that's emotionally, mentally, and physically. That is the most important thing to do. Second, if there's something that a community can do to get involved, reach out to them. They are your best resource and when it comes to combating Islamophobia in your everyday lives. Examples such as CAIR. We do very important work when it comes to legal initiatives and advocacy or work, whether it's through our chapters or in the national office, as well as reach out to your community, your neighborhood, your masjid, whatever resources you have available, and always make sure that they are helping you and that you are always in a safe spot.
And Edward, if I can just add one
Go
thing
ahead,
on to Ammar's answer,
please.
we want you to look at the different organizations that are out there. Pick one. I mean, obviously, all of us here are biased toward CAIR, so you can go to CAIR.com and sign up for our list. But pick one that aligns with you, sign up for their list. And when they ask you to take action on something, it's usually less than 5 minutes out of your day. But by you taking that action, you're no longer standing on your own. You're acting in concert with a number of other people. And I can tell you from past campaigns that we've run against major corporations, we've shut down their email servers. We've flooded their inboxes of CEOs, and we've tied up their incoming phone lines. And that can often take someone who's done something against a Muslim from ignoring our outreach to giving us the closest of attention. So that simple thing, just sign up with one Muslim organization that you agree with, makes you part of something much bigger. Just like, CAIR here in the United States is now part of something much bigger because we've partnered with all these organizations overseas.
Absolutely, absolutely. Corey, last question to you. You have been countering Islamophobia for years. You've seen a lot from after 9/11, the Bush administration's government overreach targeting Muslims, the Ground Zero Mosque, quote unquote, controversy, Donald Trump, ISIS. I mean, you've seen so many things that contributed to anti-Muslim bigotry in this country. What would you say is the state of Islamophobia now, and how is it different from maybe 5 years ago? I think you said something fascinating a few days ago about groups versus movements that I think, I'd love our audience to hear more about.
Sure, and I appreciate that question because that's always the thing that the research and advocacy department at CAIR is struggling with, is how do we make sure that we're shaping our work so that it's dealing with Islamophobia today and 10 years from now, and not how Islamophobia was 10 years ago. And one of the things that we've seen is that, in the immediate post 9/11 environment, it was people didn't bother trying to hide it. They still don't, always today. But it was sort of a diffuse movement. And I always remember looking at the news coverage of the Park 51 project, which was rebranded by an Islamophobe as the Ground Zero Mosque and became a major issue in the 2009 election season, and seeing some of the names that we would get to know so well with the Islamophobia network down the road, like Pamela Geller, Robert Spencer, David Yerushalmi, all coming together to work on a project around that just before the Park 51 episode, and then sort of, shall we say, finding their feet around Park 51. So you saw the Islamophobia network coalesce. But what's happened in the years since then is that many of those groups, first of all, they drank the Trump Kool-Aid. Act for America, Bridget Gabriel, she really doesn't bother attacking Muslims the way she used to. Every day it's just something new about how wonderful Trump is. Pamela Geller, Robert Spencer, almost ineffective nowadays here in the domestic setting. Robert Spencer's turned his attention to India in the Hindutva movement and supporting them, where Islamophobia is at its worst. Right? So he's once again looking to benefit off of people suffering, just now in India. So to that point, it used to be a number of organizations that were tightly interlinked here in the United States. We called it the Islamophobia Network. We showed how they shared board members and staff. But now, as those organizations have found other things to do, with a couple of exceptions, the Middle East Forum is still, Daniel Pipes is still sort of very invested in its Islamophobia. But now what we see is these movements, and we already discussed one of them, the Hindutva movement that is most strongly represented by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This is not just a couple of organizations. This is an entire wave, and it is able to inflict a type of suffering on Indian Muslims like we haven't seen in the past. China, a government, and its efforts to obliterate Uyghur cultures and Uyghurs within their borders is another example of it. So it's gone from these movements of organizations that fed hate and tried to influence governments. Always remember, when Trump announced the Muslim ban, he was citing a press release put together by the Center for Security Policy. So it used to be that these groups could influence government. And now many times you see in countries around the world, they have the reins of government. So it has switched from individual organizations to movements. Here in the United States, we have something of a pause, because Islamophobia really has, since its peak under Trump, has somewhat declined from the public eye. But at the same time, in Europe, you see persecution of Muslims like you haven't seen in any previous time. And you see the same in China, Burma, India. So it's our opportunity to partner with them, learn from them, from their experience, and hopefully be able to offer something to them to help them out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Corey, for that. And I think that answers the question of the audience, which was, are levels of Islamophobia the same today as they were in the early 2000s? I think you addressed that. So I want to thank both of you for being with us, gentlemen. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you for the work that you've done on Islamophobia, especially this week. And we look forward to seeing more positive work. And I'll to give a little preview, the annual CAIR Civil Rights Report, which is titled this year, Progress in the Shadow of Prejudice, is coming out when, Ammar or Corey?
Ammar?
It's coming out on April 10th, inshallah.
April 10th. So look out for that. It'll be a press release, an announcement, a press conference, and it's going to be a lot of interesting data in there that will be value to you and your community. So stay tuned for that, inshallah. And if you would like to read the joint declaration that the international Muslim groups put together, just go to CAIR.com. It's there on our homepage. And please share that with your friends and your mosques and your coworkers who are interested in these issues. Thank you both. Assalamu alaikum. We'll see you next time. And thank you all for watching. Again, may Allah grant you an accepted Ramadan. Please make sure to keep CAIR in your dua and your donations during this blessed month. We do appreciate it. And we look forward to speaking to you during the month and visiting your communities locally, inshallah. Until then, assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you.